He thought he had hit an ordinary woman. He didn't know that she was Ronda Rousey. What happened next changed not only his life, but the entire system. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video. The pale orange glow of early California morning filtered through the tall windows of Ronda Rousey's quiet home in Malibu. Nestled on a modest hill with the ocean stretching into infinity beyond the balcony, her sanctuary bore little trace of the roar and spectacle that once defined her career. The days of the roaring UFC crowds, of the spotlight and cameras, had faded into a quieter life, but her discipline remained. She rose before the sun, just as she had during Olympic training, the routine embedded into her being. A kettle hissed softly in the background as she performed a fluid sequence of warm-up stretches on a yoga mat. Her muscles, still iron-strong but tempered now by time, moved with practiced precision. The walls around her bore silent witness to a storied past, framed photographs of her judo years, of the moments inside the octagon when she'd stood triumphant, her arm raised in a clenched fist. There were no trophies displayed, no belts in glass cases. Instead, there were letters from girls she had mentored, drawings from school visits, one scrawled in the purple marker. "Thank you, Ronda. I want to be strong like you." That was the part of her legacy she guarded most fiercely now. Today's calendar was circled in blue. Venice Empower Visit, 11 a.m. The community center, located in the heart of Venice Beach, was a haven for underprivileged girls and young women, a place where sport met mentorship, where self-defense met self-worth. Ronda had visited it several times before, quietly and without media. Today, she planned to meet a new intake of girls and share her story, not the highlight reel version, but the one that began with struggle, with rejection, with grit. After dressing in jeans, a black tank top, and a light hoodie, she tied her hair back in a quick ponytail and glanced at the time. There was no rush. She had set aside the entire morning for the visit, but habit drove her to move with purpose. Sliding into her matte black Ford Raptor, she headed south along the Pacific Coast Highway. The sun climbed higher, casting golden streaks on the waves. She passed the familiar stretches of road with the relaxed, unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she was going. By 9:40, she reached Lincoln Boulevard, a bustling stretch that ran through the pulse of Venice. She pulled into the small parking lot beside a popular local cafe known for its organic coffee and egg white wraps. She had been there before. The staff were friendly, the vibe casual, and it was the perfect place to grab something quick before heading to the center. She parked legally in a clearly marked space near the entrance, stepped out of the truck, and walked toward the cafe, her mind already on the young faces she would be meeting later. Inside, the smell of espresso and toasted sourdough filled the air. She smiled politely at the barista, ordered her usual, and waited at the corner. No one inside seemed to notice her, or if they did, they respected the distance, something she appreciated. With her coffee in one hand and a small takeout bag in the other, she stepped back out into the sunlight. That was when she noticed him. He stood near her truck, broad-shouldered, white, mid-40s, buzz-cut, and wearing a Los Angeles Police Department uniform that seemed one size too tight around the chest. His posture was not that of a friendly officer ensuring public order. There was a slouch in his stance, a challenge in his narrowed eyes, and something about the way he stood with one hand near his utility belt spoke of habitual intimidation. "Excuse me," he barked as she approached. "You can't park here." Ronda blinked, caught slightly off guard. "It's a legal spot," she said calmly, gesturing to the curbside sign just a few feet away that clearly showed 2-hour parking. "I said you can't park here," he repeated, stepping forward. Rhonda didn't flinch. She simply raised her coffee to her lips, took a slow sip, and looked him in the eye. "Officer, is there a violation I'm not seeing?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned her body, lingering uncomfortably on her shoulders and chest, and then drifting to the bag in her hand. His expression twisted into something between amusement and disdain. "Little early for gym rats to be out flexing, don't you think?" he said. The air changed. Rhonda's grip on her cup tightened slightly. "I'm just picking up breakfast." He stepped closer, closing the distance in a way that felt intentional. She could smell the sour tang of his breath beneath the scent of aftershave. License and registration. "I'm not operating the vehicle. I just stepped out to get food," she said, voice steady. His lips curled. "Then maybe you should step back in and drive away before I cite you for obstruction." Something about his tone snapped into focus. It wasn't about parking. It wasn't about rules. This was power performed. Rhonda took a breath and started to walk around him, moving toward her truck. That's when he touched her. A hand shot out, fingers brushing her hip under the guise of guiding her back toward the vehicle. It was the kind of move women recognized instantly. Plausible deniability executed with impunity. Rhonda stepped away, eyes sharp now. "Don't touch me," she said quietly. He laughed, loud and sharp. "Oh, tough girl, huh? One of those fighters? You people think you can run the streets now?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were calculating now, not afraid, but assessing. Then, without warning, his open palm slapped across her cheek. The sound cracked through the morning air like a gunshot. Her coffee cup fell, the bag dropped. Her head snapped slightly to the side, but she did not stagger. She stood still. A moment passed. The world paused. A teen across the street froze, phone half raised. Another man near the cafe entrance turned abruptly. A security camera on the roof blinked silently, its red light flashing. Rhonda turned her head slowly, meeting the officer's eyes with calm intensity. He sneered. "What? You gonna cry now, sweetheart?" She didn't answer. She moved. What happened next was swift and exact. A pivot of her hips, a step forward, her left arm hooking around his striking arm while her right braced at his shoulder. His balance shifted. He stumbled. In one fluid motion, she executed a judo foot sweep, bringing him down to the concrete with controlled force. The air escaped his lungs in a surprised grunt. She knelt beside him, not with violence but with finality, one hand securing his wrist behind his back, the other pressing lightly at the base of his neck. "I suggest you stay still," she said, voice cool. The phone across the street was recording now. Another person had pulled out their phone, too. There were gasps, murmurs, then someone said it, the name that turned attention into wildfire. "Wait, is that Ronda Rousey?" The officer wheezed beneath her, trying to twist. She applied light pressure, just enough. Then she pulled out her own phone, still holding him down with one hand, and dialed. "This is Ronda Rousey. I need a supervisor at Lincoln and Palms. An LAPD officer just assaulted me." By the time 2 patrol cars arrived, a small crowd had gathered. The footage had already hit Twitter and Instagram. Local bystanders shouted over each other, retelling what they'd seen. One cafe worker gestured to the security camera. "It's all recorded. She didn't do anything. He hit her." The arriving officers separated Rhonda and the sergeant, whose name she learned was Thomas Breaker. His face was red with rage and humiliation. He was not arrested, not then. But his gun and badge were quietly taken by one of the senior officers, and he was led to the back of a squad car. Ronda gave her statement with clinical precision. She declined medical assistance. "He didn't hurt me," she said. "He just made a very bad mistake." By the time she arrived at the Venice Empower Center, her visit had already been canceled. Not by the organizers, but because the center was surrounded by reporters and drones. Every outlet in the city wanted a comment. Her face was now on every screen, and though her cheek bore no visible mark, her silence, calm, deliberate, anchored, told the world everything it needed to know. And it was only just beginning. By the next morning, Ronda Rousey's face had become the centerpiece of every major news cycle in the country. Not a still from her fighting days, not a clip from a WWE show or a past interview, but a freeze frame of her holding down an LAPD officer with calm and technical restraint. Her expression unreadable, her body positioned not as a threat but as control incarnate. Alongside it played the now viral footage, raw, uncut, and seen over 6 million times within 12 hours. It showed the slap, the silence, the takedown. It needed no commentary. The image alone sparked outrage, admiration, division, and disbelief. Networks scrambled for statements. Talk shows dissected her posture, her response, her expression, as though it were a chess move in a national match. Some praised her restraint, calling her a role model. Others, mostly from partisan corners, questioned her provocation, implying she might have escalated the situation. But most people saw what it was: a woman publicly assaulted by a man in power, and who, instead of shrinking, stood taller. Ronda herself stayed silent. She declined interviews, requests for comment, even a statement on social media. Her publicist released only a single sentence: "Miss Rousey is cooperating fully with the investigation and is grateful for the public support." But silence from her did not mean silence around her. On Twitter, the hashtag #JusticeForRonda began to climb. Overnight, it merged with others: #FightLikeRonda, #EndPoliceSexism, #SheDidn'tFlinch. Female athletes from every sport reposted the video. UFC veterans, boxers, Olympic medalists, and professional wrestlers stood behind her, releasing statements of solidarity. One, from Olympic javelin thrower Tori Matthews, simply said, "This is what happens when a predator forgets who he's preying on." The LAPD, for its part, scrambled to contain the storm. Their initial statement, bland and hollow, claimed that an incident involving an officer and a civilian is under internal review, and that the department takes allegations seriously. But within hours, that statement was met with a wave of public ridicule. Everyone had seen the footage. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for spin. Still, the institution tried. The following afternoon, a heavily edited version of the security footage began circulating, one that showed the conversation but cut off before the slap. It appeared online, shared by a right-leaning news outlet, with a caption implying that Ronda had aggressively confronted the officer. The attempt at narrative manipulation was clumsy and obvious, but effective in sowing the first seeds of doubt among certain circles. That version was debunked almost immediately, yet the damage, however minor, was done. Ronda watched none of it. She spent most of that day in her home gym, working the bag with clinical precision, the strikes clean, timed, breathing even. There was no rage in her movements, only calculation, presence, and control. A storm churned outside her walls, but inside, she was anchoring herself. Then came the letter. It was slid under her front door sometime in the evening. No envelope, Just a single sheet of paper, folded once, the handwriting thick, all caps. "Stay quiet, or you'll lose more than just a fight." She stared at it for a long time, not afraid, not even surprised, just resolved. She called her attorney. Marissa Evans was a civil rights lawyer, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, known for her relentless pursuit of justice in cases involving police misconduct, particularly against women and minorities. She had a track record of unsettling comfortable institutions and forcing buried reports into the light. She wasn't just a legal representative, she was a scalpel against systemic decay. By 10 p.m., Marissa sat in Ronda's living room, her laptop open, a legal pad already half covered in shorthand. They spoke briefly about the incident, the videos, and the warning note. Then Marissa asked the one question Ronda had already been turning over in her mind. "Do you want to pursue this quietly?" she said, "or do you want to burn the system down?" Ronda's answer came without hesitation. "It's not about me anymore." They began to dig. Within days, using a combination of public records, whistleblower tips, and internal complaints databases, Marissa unearthed the first disturbing pattern. The officer who had assaulted Ronda, Sergeant Thomas Breaker, had no formal disciplinary record. His file on paper was clean, glowing even. Letters of commendation, overtime awards, a note of praise from a former precinct captain. But as Marissa peeled back the layers, she uncovered traces of something more sinister. Redacted complaints, missing body cam footage, and retracted civilian testimonies. In 4 separate cases, women had filed harassment or use of force complaints against Breaker in the past 5 years. None of them went anywhere. One name stood out. A college student, Emily Zavala, who claimed Breaker had pulled her over late at night and made inappropriate comments, touching her wrist under the guise of checking for a bracelet weapon. The complaint had vanished. The student had since moved states. Marissa reached out to her through old contacts. Zavala responded within the hour. She remembered everything, and she was still afraid. In the days that followed, 3 more women came forward, all with eerily similar stories: public stops, lewd insinuations, sudden anger, and strategic intimidation. One of them had filed a formal complaint and had received an anonymous call days later warning her to drop it. She had. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture, not just of a rogue officer, but of a system built to protect him. Ronda listened to their stories in silence. Not stoic silence, active, furious silence. She saw the thread between their experiences and her own. And she saw, more than anything, that this was not coincidence. Then came the real breakthrough. Through a confidential source in the LAPD Archives Department, a clerk who sympathized with the movement, Marissa received a scanned copy of a document labeled Unit 8B, Protocols and Officer Assignments. On the surface, it appeared to be an internal training manual for a specialized tactical response group. But, buried in the back pages, she found a list. Officers assigned under ASS-8, Observational Supervision. Sergeant Breaker's name was on it. Ronda read the page twice, then looked at Marissa. "What's S8? "We're about to find out," she replied. The following morning, Marissa arranged a meeting with a retired LAPD detective, now a private security consultant, who had once trained incoming officers on department culture. When asked about S8, his face darkened. "They used to call it Sector 8, he said. "It was unofficial, but everyone knew. Started about 10 years ago, after the riots in Echo Park. The idea was to have a group of street correctors, guys who could handle unrest before it became public. They weren't violent at first, just watchmen. But over time, it turned into a fraternity. Mostly male. Mostly white. A lot of military transfers. They covered each other, and when things got messy, they knew how to make it disappear. And Breaker? One of the worst, but protected. Always protected. Ronda felt her stomach twist, not from fear, but from recognition. She had seen this kind of power cluster before, in gyms, locker rooms, even in Hollywood. Men who laughed too hard at off-color jokes. Men who looked past lines until those lines vanished. The difference now was that they wore badges. That night, after Marissa left, Ronda stood on her back deck overlooking the ocean, the breeze sharp against her skin. Her phone buzzed. Another message. This time, not a threat, just a screenshot. A group chat, a name circled. Breaker. Next to it, a caption. If she doesn't shut up, we'll remind her why we run this town. The sender was anonymous. The message time-stamped 2 minutes before. She turned and walked back inside. She knew what she had to do now. This wasn't about a slap anymore. This wasn't about a rogue cop with a bad temper. This was a system. And she was going to dismantle it. Piece by piece, name by name, blow by blow. The world thought she had finished fighting. They were wrong. She had only just begun. The days following the group chat leak were unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but warns. Ronda had known tension before fights, before press conferences, before major decisions, but this was different. This was institutional silence. Not the absence of words, but the presence of watching eyes and waiting moves. Every hour that passed without a formal police statement, every news cycle that regurgitated only safe phrases about ongoing internal investigations felt like a calculated pause. As though someone, some group, was taking inventory, deciding what to sacrifice and what to salvage. Ronda didn't waste the silence. She filled it with action. Together with Marissa Evans, she began building a profile not of a man, but of a network. Sergeant Thomas Breaker was no longer the focal point. He was now the entry wound. The infection ran deeper. Marissa's legal team pulled every complaint linked to Breaker over the last decade, but it wasn't the complaints that mattered most. It was the missing ones. There were gaps. Gaps in disciplinary logs, sudden deletions in body cam archives, timestamps that didn't align with dispatch records. And every time they traced one of those anomalies, a new name surfaced. One of them was Officer Dorian Hale. His name had appeared in 2 use-of-force investigations that were quietly closed after internal resolution. Another was Lieutenant James Kearns, whose signature authorized a transfer request for Breaker to Venice Division just 6 months before the incident. And then there was the most important name, Captain Roger Millen. His name was on every approval, every clearance, every buried file. He wasn't just in the know. He was orchestrating. But none of this was conclusive. None of it would survive public scrutiny on its own. They needed more. They needed someone who had been on the inside, someone who had touched the gears of this machine and lived to tell about it. That's when Marissa mentioned a woman, a former LAPD officer named Vanessa Pierce. Vanessa had left the department 2 years ago under what the press called stress-related retirement. But the truth was darker. She had filed a sexual harassment claim against a fellow officer, one whose name, unsurprisingly, also appeared on the Unit 8B document. Her case was dismissed, the complaint sealed, and within months she had resigned. Ronda met her in a coffee shop in Pasadena, chosen for its open layout and multiple exits. Vanessa arrived in plain clothes, hair cut short, eyes guarded. She looked around twice before sitting down. "I saw your video," she said, skipping greetings. "Took guts. They don't like when women stand up." "I don't care what they like," Ronda replied evenly. "I care what they've done, and what they're still doing." Vanessa hesitated, then pulled out a flash drive. "After I left, I kept a few things. Screenshots, emails, internal rosters. I didn't go to the press because I was scared. Still am, honestly. But after what they did to you, I guess I remembered I used to be brave." The flash drive was gold. On it were inter-office memos discussing selective suppression tactics, unofficial meeting notes from Sector 8 briefings, and even digital copies of training materials that emphasized assertive behavioral deterrence, a euphemism for intimidation. But the most telling document was an internal email thread in which a supervising officer instructed staff to flag any reports filed by known agitators or liberal influencers for strategic handling. Ronda's name appeared on the thread, dated 2 months before the incident. They had been watching her, not just reacting to her presence that morning on Lincoln Boulevard. They had already marked her, already labeled her a problem. The slap wasn't spontaneous, it was provoked, perhaps even planned. The realization hit hard, not emotionally, but strategically. She had assumed she was fighting a culture, but this wasn't culture, it was policy. With Vanessa's information, the puzzle began to assemble with terrifying clarity. Sector 8 wasn't a rogue unit. It was an informal doctrine enforced by a shadow hierarchy within the LAPD. It recruited officers with military backgrounds or aggressive field records. It emphasized discretion, loyalty, and the containment of public threats, a term that, according to one training file, included activists, journalists, undocumented individuals, and high-visibility women with oppositional profiles. That last one was underlined in the source document. It was dated 3 years ago. Ronda brought the findings to an investigative journalist she had worked with years earlier, Derek Liang, a quiet bulldog of a reporter who wrote less for fame than for facts. He had exposed a municipal fraud case in the Department of Sanitation years back, and had since made enemies in every city hall office from Santa Monica to San Diego. He listened carefully as Marissa presented the data, his eyes narrowing but never widening. He wasn't shocked, just angry. "I've heard whispers," he said. "Sector 8. It's like a ghost, the kind of thing that changes names every 2 years to avoid audit. No paper trail, no public existence, just a pattern of cleared complaints and shifting names." "Can you verify it?" Ronda asked. Derek leaned back. "Not through conventional means, but I've got a former contact in IA, Internal Affairs. If I can get him to open the right door, we'll see what falls out." It took 4 days. Then, late one night, Ronda received a call from Derek. His voice was tight, urgent. "Captain Millen is connected to a shell company registered under the name Stratfield Holdings. Stratfield received a city contract to provide consulting services to LAPD 6 years ago. Guess what their specialty was?" "What?" Ronda asked. "Urban crowd control, behavioral suppression. They designed the protocol that became the unofficial blueprint for Sector 8. Millen signed the deal. He profited from it. And here's the kicker. They trained Breaker, not at the academy, off book, in a private facility in Pomona. The pieces were in place. All they needed now was the ignition. Ronda decided the world should hear the truth, not in court filings, not in leaks, but from her own mouth. She and Marissa organized a press conference, discreet, but open to every major outlet. It would be held at a community center in Echo Park, not far from where the riots had birthed Sector 8 years before. The location was symbolic. The message would be clear. That morning, the room was filled with reporters, camera crews, civil rights leaders, and survivors. On a modest stage with no logos behind her, Ronda stepped up to the podium. She wore no makeup, no suit, just her training jacket, faded and familiar. She spoke slowly, carefully. She detailed the incident with Breaker, but she went further, deeper. She spoke of the women who had come forward, of the documents, of Sector 8. She named names: Breaker, Millen, Hale, Kearns. She presented evidence. She handed flash drives to the journalists present. She quoted from the training documents word for word. "This is not a story about one officer. It's not a story about me," she said. "It's a story about what happens when power operates without consequence, when silence becomes policy, when women are treated as objects to humiliate or threats to neutralize. I didn't get slapped because I broke a rule. I got slapped because I refused to follow one." The room erupted in questions, but she stepped back. She didn't stay for applause. She wasn't looking for applause. Outside, protesters had already begun to gather, some holding signs, others just standing in quiet witness. Among them, Ronda saw familiar faces. Women from the gym, survivors she had spoken to, strangers with tired eyes and square shoulders. It had begun. By that evening, the mayor's office issued a statement pledging a comprehensive review of all LAPD units associated with non-standard operations. Internal Affairs announced a formal investigation into Captain Millen's contracts. Breaker's suspension became a termination. Officer Hale disappeared from his precinct without explanation, but none of it surprised Ronda. She had seen systems panic before. They didn't crumble all at once. They trembled first, and when they trembled, that's when the cracks began to show. The sun rose on Los Angeles with a new sense of weight, as though the city itself had paused between breaths. The press conference from the day before dominated headlines. "Rousey drops bomb on LAPD," read one. "Sector 8 exposed, a shadow doctrine inside the department," read another. The footage of Ronda speaking, calm, firm, unflinching, had circulated across every major network. She didn't use theatrics, she didn't yell, but in her voice was something more powerful: proof. And with it came the most dangerous weapon of all: clarity. Ronda spent that morning alone in the gym, the one she had built near her Malibu property, not for training others, but for herself. A quiet retreat that smelled of leather, chalk, and silence. She worked the heavy bag slowly, rhythmically, letting her thoughts move with her strikes. She wasn't thinking about Breaker anymore, not about the slap, not about the moment he lost control. That had only been the match. What mattered now was the war, and the system that trained him to believe he had a right to lay his hands on her. By late morning, the consequences began to roll. LAPD's Internal Affairs Division issued a formal suspension of Captain Roger Millen pending investigation. More notable, however, was the language used. The department didn't just cite administrative concerns or protocol inconsistencies. They referenced violations of ethics, unauthorized operational doctrines, and abuse of internal influence structures. For the first time, Sector 8 wasn't just being acknowledged, it was being named. The mayor's office, under mounting pressure, called for an emergency audit of all tactical and advisory programs operating under the city's police umbrella. The public outcry had become deafening. Calls flooded local government offices. Civil rights groups staged protests outside City Hall, Venice Beach, Echo Park, Koreatown, Every community that had felt the weight of unofficial policing stood with signs and chants. But it wasn't chaos. It was coordination. It was power reasserting itself from the ground up. Yet the pushback came swiftly. Within hours of the press conference, Ronda's phone lit up with threats, not anonymous this time. Pseudonymous, crafted, sophisticated. One email attached a photo of her standing outside her own house, time-stamped less than 15 minutes earlier. Another included a list of her past locations over the past week, accurate to the hour. It wasn't just intimidation. It was surveillance. She didn't flinch. She documented everything and forwarded it directly to Marissa, who had already instructed her IT team to monitor unusual activity. What they uncovered was chilling. Multiple attempts had been made to access Ronda's email, her phone logs, and even her home security system. The traces pointed to a compromised city server. Someone inside the department still had reach, and they were using it. Marissa took the findings directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office. A special federal prosecutor had just been assigned to evaluate whether Sector 8's existence constituted not just departmental misconduct, but criminal conspiracy. The evidence gathered by Ronda and her team, including Vanessa Pierce's documents, the flash drives, and the contract trail leading back to Stratfield Holdings, now sat inside a sealed envelope on a federal desk. Then came the tipping point. A second woman stepped forward publicly. Her name was Amina Khan, a former collegiate wrestler who had filed a complaint against Breaker 5 years earlier after he allegedly harassed and groped her during a traffic stop. Her case had been closed without explanation. Now, seeing Ronda's stand, she decided to speak. She didn't just confirm Breaker's actions. She revealed that an internal investigator at the time had warned her off pursuing the complaint, telling her, "He's protected. It'll only make things worse for you." Her words hit harder than any headline, because it wasn't Ronda's voice now. It was a stranger, a civilian, a woman without a platform who had been silenced and then erased until someone gave her space to be heard. That afternoon, civil rights lawyer Gloria Ibanez, representing a coalition of legal firms, announced a class action suit against the city of Los Angeles, the LAPD, and the individual officers involved in Sector 8. The legal grounds included civil rights violations, systemic harassment, psychological abuse, and obstruction of justice. At last count, 27 women had come forward with matching patterns of behavior from the same cluster of officers. 10 of them cited Breaker, 15 named others. The connections were no longer abstract, they were mapped, and they were damning. In response, LAPD issued a sudden statement. Breaker had been officially terminated. Internal Affairs had opened full reviews on all named officers. And most shocking of all, the department confirmed that Sector 8 operated without formal approval, and that its activities are under full federal review. It wasn't accountability. Not yet. But it was the beginning. For the first time, the walls were cracking from within. The following day, federal agents, accompanied by DOJ observers, executed warrants on several facilities named in the Stratfield contracts. One of them, a private training center in Pomona, had long been listed as a community engagement site. In reality, it was a tactical compound. Inside, agents found materials used for off-book officer training, altered manuals, footage of mock arrests, scenario simulations with scripts that included lines like "control before comply" and "fear is the first step to order." Among the documents seized was a printed packet labeled S8 Protocol Tier 3 External Interference Strategy. The language within outlined techniques for dealing with public figures who interfered with internal police operations, celebrities, journalists, athletes, activists. Ronda's name appeared twice, both in context of media risk mitigation. The evidence was staggering, but Ronda didn't gloat. She didn't post a victory message. She kept working. Her next step was personal. She wrote to the California State Athletic Commission requesting permission to establish a new program, Self-Defense Empowerment for Civilian Women. The goal wasn't just to teach technique, but to educate. About rights, about boundaries, about what real power looked like when it came from within, not from a badge or a uniform. The application was approved in less than 48 hours. At the same time, the gym she had long kept private began filling with women, some local, some who traveled hours, eager not to be trained like fighters, but to be taught how not to freeze, how to stand, how to protect themselves in a world that too often denied them even that. One night, after a long training session, Ronda stepped outside to the cool air of late evening. The street was quiet. Then a voice called out. She turned to see a teenage girl, no older than 15, standing nervously by the gate. Her hands trembled. She wore a hoodie, jeans, and a backpack slung over one shoulder. "I'm sorry to bother you," the girl said. I saw your video. I wanted to say thank you." Ronda nodded slowly, walking toward her. "My mom, she used to say that people like us didn't get to fight back," the girl continued. "But then I saw you, and now I think maybe we can." Ronda smiled softly. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply opened the gate. The next day, Ronda was called to testify before a state oversight committee reviewing the LAPD's structure and its response to systemic misconduct. Her statement was simple, powerful, and without pretense. "They didn't come for me because I was dangerous," she told the committee. "They came for me because I was visible, because I wouldn't play scared. But the real danger wasn't me. It was every woman they silenced who didn't have a camera or a crowd or a medal. That's who we fight for." The room was still. The report from that committee would later result in the suspension of dozens of LAPD contracts with private firms and the dissolution of all known informal units not sanctioned by the department's code of conduct. It was a bureaucratic shift, but a crucial one, because it meant the ground was finally shifting. And through it all, Ronda remained exactly who she was. Not a symbol, not a martyr. A woman who refused to accept that silence was strength. A woman who understood that dignity wasn't granted by uniforms or systems. It was claimed by those willing to stand when others sit down. The facade had cracked, and beneath it, the truth had survived. The weeks that followed were unlike any Ronda had lived through. In the past, she had known what it meant to train for a fight. She had understood preparation in the language of sweat, repetition, bruises, and silence. But this fight, was something else. It was legal briefings instead of sparring drills. It was media inquiries instead of weigh-ins. It was sitting across tables from victims, survivors, and lawyers, each one carrying a story that should have been heard years ago. Her world, once filled with the rhythm of strikes and the pulse of arenas, had shifted into one of whispered testimony and relentless determination. The class action lawsuit filed by Gloria Ibanez's coalition had grown in scope and volume. New plaintiffs joined weekly. Women from across California and some from out of state stepped forward. Their stories carried variations of the same theme: power abused under the cover of uniform, voice suppressed under the guise of procedure. Ronda met with many of them. Not in interview rooms or on camera, but in quiet spaces, over coffee or across gym mats. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the details not with a fighter's grimace, but with a woman's ache. The city of Los Angeles, under immense pressure, began negotiations to settle the lawsuit, even as federal prosecutors pushed forward with a separate investigation. But Ronda had little interest in settlements. She understood the importance of compensation, of justice rendered on paper. But she also knew that money could not rebuild what had been systematically destroyed: dignity, trust, a sense of safety. That would take something more permanent. She turned her focus to building that permanence. The self-defense empowerment program she had proposed was no longer a concept. With funding from private donors, public grants, and volunteer instructors, it expanded rapidly. Classes were held in converted school gyms, church basements, community centers. Women of all ages came: teenagers from rough neighborhoods, mothers, retirees, survivors. Some came to learn. Some just came to be surrounded by strength. Ronda taught whenever she could. She didn't lecture. She demonstrated. She didn't talk about aggression. She talked about awareness, boundaries, balance. Her sessions became less about how to fight back and more about reclaiming space: physical, emotional, psychological. With each class, she saw something growing in their posture. Not arrogance, not defiance, just presence. Media attention still followed her, but it had changed in tone. The sensationalism faded, replaced by something steadier. Journalists wanted not just quotes, but context. Ronda used those platforms wisely. She didn't make herself the centerpiece. She directed focus to the women, the stories, the patterns. When invited onto national broadcasts, she declined unless survivors were allowed to speak first. Some outlets refused. She let them walk. The political landscape began to shift as well. In Sacramento, lawmakers introduced a bill aimed at increasing civilian oversight over specialized police units. The proposed law, informally dubbed the Rousey Act by supporters, would mandate third-party review of all non-standard tactical divisions and require public disclosure of training methods for any unit operating with discretionary enforcement power. The bill faced immediate resistance from law enforcement unions, but the public pressure was undeniable. Voters weren't just watching, they were demanding. One late afternoon, as Ronda prepared for an evening class, Marissa Evans arrived at the gym carrying a thin folder and a quiet expression. She sat on the bench by the weight rack, flipping it open slowly. "They're moving forward with indictments," she said. "3 officers from Sector 8. One of them is Breaker." Ronda nodded but said nothing. Marissa continued. "But that's not all. Millen's being charged as well. Fraud, misconduct, conspiracy. And the DOJ is recommending internal restructuring for the LAPD. They're already freezing the private contracts connected to Stratfield Holdings." There was no triumphant reaction from Ronda. No smile, no celebration, only a long exhale, like a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That's something," she said finally. "It's not everything," Marissa replied, "but it's a start." They sat in silence for a moment longer before Marissa added, "You know what you've done, right? What's happening, it's not just consequence, it's change." Ronda looked out the window where a small group of girls were arriving for class. One of them was wearing a shirt with Ronda's face on it, drawn like a comic book heroine, cape and all. "I didn't do it for that," she said. "I know," Marissa said. "That's why it worked." The gym became more than a gym. It became a headquarters, a refuge, a crossroads. Activists came through, offering resources. Therapists volunteered their time. Lawyers provided free consultations. It was organic, unstructured, and powerful. Not a movement named after a person, but one seated in a refusal to be erased. And then, on a Monday morning with fog rolling in from the ocean, Ronda received a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real letter, handwritten and folded twice. It read, "You don't know me. I'm one of the ones who kept quiet, but I watched everything you did. I saw you not flinch. I saw you stand. And now I believe I can too. You didn't just fight for us. You reminded us we were worth the fight." There was no name, no return address, just those words. Ronda folded the letter carefully and slid it into the small drawer by her desk, the one where she kept old medals, forgotten ticket stubs, and one photo of her mother lifting her arm in a childhood judo tournament. Later that day, she appeared before the California Senate Judiciary Committee to testify in support of the new legislation. She wore a plain black suit, no jewelry, no makeup. When asked why the bill mattered, she didn't talk about her own story. She spoke of the women she met, the patterns that connected their pain, the silence that was never just accidental but designed. "They built a system that taught us to fear speaking," she said. "So we built a system that makes silence impossible." The bill passed committee. A month later, the state assembly approved it, and when the governor signed it into law, he did so with the survivors standing beside him. The following week, Ronda was invited to appear on a late-night talk show to reflect on the journey. She declined. She had a class to teach. She returned to the gym just as the evening light turned the sky gold. The girls were already warming up. She walked in, nodded once, and began the lesson. She corrected stances, adjusted balance, laughed with them when one girl tripped over her own feet. And when the class ended, she handed each of them a card with the words she had learned to live by. Presence, boundaries, power. She didn't sign them. She didn't need to. She walked outside as the last student left, the quiet street stretching before her. There were no cameras now, no microphones, just the rhythm of her own breath and the knowledge that the fight, for once, had not been about winning. It had been about showing others how not to lose. And that, in the end, was a different kind of victory. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't miss the next one, and share this video so others can see what really happened.